Welcome Dr. Edward Shirley from St. Edward's University, Miss Crystal McCormick from Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and Dr. James Puglisi from St. Edward's University. Please welcome all.
Very good. We will start. We have three speakers, all of them from Texas. They brought their fur coats along to our three speakers are all from Texas. I said they brought their fur coats along because it is cold in Canada. I'm told that each speaker has 15 minutes, and I have the unpleasant task of letting them know when these 15 minutes are up. This is what I was told. So the first speaker will be Professor Shirley, whom you already met because he chaired the last session, and he will speak to us. His title is Seeking the Lower Place, a dialogue with Fethullah Gulen's understanding of Sufism and Franciscan spirituality. Please.
15. One metaphor that is used in many spiritual traditions is that of water flowing downhill, seeking the lower place, but by doing so, eroding the mountain. And this got me to thinking about some of the common themes in Fethullah Gulen's understanding of Sufism and the spiritual path of St. Francis of Assisi. Enlightenment, union with God, discovering the true self are not attained through collection of facts, intellectual acuity, or force of will. The path is, in the words of St. John of the Cross, that of nada, self-negation. In the Christian tradition, this is grounded in Jesus' own teaching to take up one's cross and follow him, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile. Those who seek to save themselves, he says, will lose themselves, and those who lose themselves for my sake will find themselves. St. Paul's letter to Philippians calls this kenosis, self-emptying God. The five pillars are each designed to lead the Muslim more and more deeply into submission to God. From the confession that there is no God but God, and what idol is greater than the ego, to participate in the Hajj, where peasant and king approach the Kaaba equally. The ideal of Islam is not merely external practice, but internal transformation. The internal process is explored by many Sufi lineages within Islam. Fethullah Gulen is a contemporary Islamic thinker whose teachings are influenced by Sufi teachings. Gulen, Sufism is, we could say, is a type of fulfillment of Islam. It is not outside of Islam, but it takes us right to the center. In the same way, Francis of Assisi never saw his followers as leaving the Christian community. He saw all of the common Christian practices as essential for his followers. So Gulen enumerates many elements of the Sufi path, including self-criticism, privacy and solitude, sadness and sorrow, joyful zeal, asceticism, patience, dhikr, and openness and contraction. For the sake of brevity, this paper will focus on three of those elements: self-criticism, sadness and sorrow, and asceticism. The first element of Gulen's treatment of Sufism with this paper will examine is called muhasaba, self-criticism. Literally, this means reckoning, settling accounts, and self-interrogation. Similar to what the Christian tradition calls examination of conscience or examination of consciousness, the believer looks at his or her actions, thanks God for the good they have done, and asks forgiveness for their sins, with the hope in growing in what Gulen calls one's personal loyalty to God. Such practice, Gulen says, is essential to this true spiritual growth, for one's relationship with God depends on awareness that takes place in his or her inner world. The practice of self-criticism is like a lamp in the heart, enabling the believer to distinguish between good and evil, virtue and sin. Not only does it remind the believer that sin will be punished, but opens him or her to the peace and tranquility of God. Continual practice of self-criticism leads towards spiritual perfection. Quote, evening review of words and actions said or done during the day are the rule, as are morning resolutions to avoid sins. It is to those who so practice that the doors of heaven will be thrown open. The second element of Sufi practice for our discussion is the combination of sadness and sorrow, huzun. This goes beyond sorrow for one's personal sins. It's rather sadness that accompanies a lover of God in the midst of indifference to the divine. Gulen says, until the truth proclaimed by the prophet seeps into every corner of the world, until the, quote, sighs of Muslims and other oppressed peoples cease, until the divine will is manifest throughout the world, there will be tears of sorrow. Here again, Gulen finds a resonance with the Jewish and Christian scriptures, particularly Isaiah, who says, for the yoke that burdened them, the pole on their shoulder, and the rod of their taskmasters you have smashed, as on the day of Midian. For every boot that trampled in battle, every cloak rolled in blood, will be burned as for flames. This sadness, Gulen says, is necessary for the spiritual life, for it protects the heart from rust and decay. The focus is not only on one's personal sins, but is also grounded in the human condition. It causes the believer to constantly turn to God for aid in every activity and has a communal as well as personal dimension. Citing a Sufi teacher, God sometimes has mercy on a whole nation because of the weeping of a sad, broken-hearted one. Huzun purifies the soul and maintains that purity. The third and final element of Gulen's understanding of Sufism that we'll explore is Zuhd, asceticism. Gulen notes that though the literal meaning of Zuhd is the renunciation of worldly pleasures and carnal desires, for Sufis, this is indifference to the worldly appetites, living an austere life, and, quote, despising the world's carnal and material aspects. There are two steps in asceticism. The first is renunciation of that which is forbidden.